So we are in the midst of the Kvod Abriya Sugya. We're doing the chapter of my book, which is called "Can you tell me how this Rishon read the Gemara?" So the goal is we're going to try and read the Gemara, and then we're going to build towards reading one Rishon that I discovered a couple of years ago after I taught the Sugya many times, and realized I just had absolutely no way to fit this Rishon with the Sugya. So we'll see if you can figure it out a way to do it. Along the way, we'll learn all sorts of interesting things about Gemara, I hope. Okay, so we started right. The beginning was a statement of Yehuda Amar Rav. So we are in the first and second generation of Amoraim, and he says somebody who finds shatnez in their garment, pushed on, has to remove those garments, afilu bashuk, even in public. So we talked about a lot of variables in there that don't matter to us right now, whether it's only your garment or somebody else's garments, whether you're wearing undergarments or not wearing undergarments, whether you're male or female, all sorts of ways in it. We're going to treat it just as an abstract statement. X who finds and all those other things are irrelevant to the conceptual pattern of the Gemara. Okay. Now the Gemara says, "My Tama, what's the reason?" And it says, "Ein chachma ve'ein tzvanav ve'ein tzala neged Hashem." It's a quote from a pasuk in Mishlei. Kol makom sheish chilul Hashem ein cholkin kavod l'rav. So I asserted last week, and Marty called me on me, but I'm still not going to answer the question this week. Marty turned away. So literally, it's dealing with the context of kavod harav, and so we have to figure out what is the kavod harav here, which is being overridden, by chilul Hashem, and we have to figure out what exactly the chilul Hashem is as well. So I'm asserting for now, without proving, that the original context of that statement are questions in which students act to object to someone else's behavior in the presence of their teacher, even though their teacher is not actively objecting. And the chilul Hashem is somebody violating halakha in front of their teacher, and the kavod harav is that they are speaking in front of their teacher. And so the meaning of the original statement is you don't have to worry about speaking in front of your teacher when a chilul Hashem is being created by somebody publicly violating halakha or halakha in the presence of your teacher. My assertion is that this is irrelevant to the context of this Gemara. It just happens to be the previous case in which this pasuk in Mishlei was quoted. And that really what matters here is the pasuk in Mishlei. The easiest evidence of that in the sugya is that the phrase chilul Hashem and the phrase kavod harav never appear again in the sugya. The sugya just continually just quotes the pasuk in Mishlei again. So the pasuk in Mishlei is taken, I claim, as standing for the proposition that nothing human has worth when it opposes God's command. And so we take kilayim as a prototype of God's command. We take public nakedness as a prototype of something that gives human beings value. And we say, look, we learn from here, that divine command overrides anything that human beings think have worth about themselves, any notion of dignity. We learn from the application of Mishlei to the case. As opposed to making it a narrow ruling about kilayim, and public nakedness, we make it a ruling that's just generally, it stands for that proposition. Okay, I pointed out last week that this is a almost definitionally false proposition, or at least misleading, because the question that we don't want to ask is, what does God want? Of course, we're not going to go against God's command. But the question is, when God issues commands, do those commands have a built-in except when they violate certain things that God gives value to about human beings? So in a sense, framing it that way is misleading. But the Gemara chooses to frame it, to frame it that way, as a question of whether there are human values that override divine command, and really it's just a question of understanding divine commands. To what extent do we think that God that God doesn't command in such cases? Yeah. So follow divine command. Okay. Okay, so you want to start arguing, right? I didn't talk that maybe the Gemara only means maybe we should only rule that halacha, the divine command overrides human dignity in cases where the human being had some way of preventing it. Right. But what's your criteria for that? Your criteria is going to be what God wants. No? God is willing to take the right to allow his command to override your dignity in a case where you had a choice, and God is not willing to override your dignity. I can always reframe it that way. Right? I can always reframe it that way. But it's right, but it's a really interesting thing that the Gemara doesn't seem to have my philosophic qualms. And the Gemara frames it this way as if it's a human decision to override. Right? Theoretically, there would be a human decision to override God's command, but right now it's not a philosophic problem because guess what? Right? We said that it never does. Right? So we have, instead of a philosophic problem, we have as a justice problem. Right? Why should God's command be willing to not take any account of human dignity? Is that really our conception of God's command, that it takes away human dignity? And right now we're saying, yeah. Right? Our conception of God's commands are that they override human dignity, and that doesn't bother us yet. But what I've tried to argue last week, and I'll show again this week, is that this I think is one of the best sugyas to show the Talmud as a rhetorical construction, and not as a recording of a live dialogue. So this is one of the advantages of the thing I haven't shown Marty is that it tells you that the rationale was not part of the original statement. The rationale is inserted by the editor deliberately to create this. Right, to create this element, which I think is obviously going to be false. That there's no value to human dignity at all in the system. That's why it imports from somewhere else, as opposed to that's really what, right? That's part of the proof that Rabbi wouldn't actually have said that, because why would Rabbi say Nichol Kinka V'Darav? There's nothing to do with anything here. Although I pointed out last time that the art, right, that the Rambam, I think it is, will say that you take off even your teacher's clothing. Right, that's how he gets the Kavod Rav into the sugya. So you'll have to see if you find that compelling to, right? That's a way to get Kavod Rav into the sugya. Okay, so the structure of the sugya is we're now going to quote 5 Breitot, each of which seem to stand for a disproof of the proposition. That is, they seem to stand for cases where human dignity in fact overrides halacha, and if halacha and divine command are equivalent, so then right they contradict the Amaraic statement of Rabbi Amarav. Okay, so the first one is a case right where we talked about some of the details last week, where it seems that there is a Kohen who is accompanying a mourner in a situation where the mourner has a choice whether to, on the way back from a funeral, whether to take a tahor road or a tamei road. Ordinarily, the Kohen would be permitted to accompany the mourner on the tahor road, but not be permitted to accompany the mourner on the tamei road, assuming we're talking about tamei via corpse. The Braita nonetheless says that that if the mourner takes the antecedents are really hard, but the way we have it is Baba Torah, assuming, meaning if the mourner takes the tahor path, Vayinimo b'Torah, then they, meaning the Kohen accompaniers, go with them on the tahor path. Baba b'Tmeya, similarly, right, and if he comes on the Tmeya, Vayinimo b'Tmeya, mishum kvodo. Okay, so Gemara says Amai, and this is the catchphrase Lema. Why don't we say right? If the Kohen is divinely commanded not to become tamei, and the reason to accompany the mourner is because it's dishonorable to the mourner for the mourner to have to go alone. Now, again, we could challenge this. So who says the mourner is going alone? Maybe there are 150 Israelim there accompanying the mourner. No one will ever notice you're there. So we have to go with the Gemara's construction of the case that in some way there is a diminution of the mourner's honor if the mourner is not accompanied. So the Gemara answers, Tir Gemara Rabbi Abba bevesa pras derabanan. So Rabbi Abba made an okimta, right? He said that he narrowed the scope of the case, and he said it's the only time you're allowed to accompany the mourner on tamei path is if the path is only tamei derabanan, the special case of beta pras. Right? Then we talk about why a beta pras, which is a field that used to have used to have a corpse, but no longer has an intact corpse, but might have little pieces of corpse scattered around throughout it. So I pointed out that Rabbi Abba is an Amora, whereas the editor of the Talmud presumably is later. And so when this Braita is quoted, it's not quoted as if there's a live moment where we think, oh my goodness, we have disproven our initial thesis. It's a literary structure, which is right where the goal of asking the question is to insert the answer. Right? Everyone knows the answer is coming. Right? There's no suspense that way because the because the Breita and its accompanying Okimta were a package that are being quoted, and it just happens that we add punctuation into the package with suspense, question mark, exclamation point, and then answer point. Okay, it could very well be that the reason Rabbi Abba came up with Okimta originally was because of that question, or not. I pointed out last week there was some controversy about it so it looks like, for pedagogic purposes, sometimes I think that students think that the Talmud makes up Okimtas and then they lose faith in the integrity of the system, because how can you say, right, it's obvious you can go with the mourner, right? Where do you get this idea it's only talking about the Rabbanans? If it was only talking about the Rabbanans, should have said so. So I pointed out that the case is very peculiar, right? Because there's a much more obvious case if you thought human dignity overrode, even the dignity of the mourner overrode the Kohen's mitzvah, not the prohibition to become tamei. The Kohen should have been able to go to the funeral. Right? Constructing the case as on the way back from the funeral must mean, must mean even when no one argues that mourners that Kohenim can accompany mourners to funerals, must mean that there's a difference between the funeral and the road, and it's very hard to argue that the road is more covered than the funeral, and therefore it seems there must be a difference in the level of tuma. Right. So I think that the Okimta is plausible, and I think it's also important to understand the Okimta was probably not constructed in order to meet the challenge. The Okimta was probably constructed to explain the case. Right? Why is it on the way back as opposed to the funeral? The answer is let's be talking about where it's made. Okay, so this is what should have. So we had the second case, which is Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok, who's a Kohen. Said that we used to jump over coffins in order to greet Jewish kings, and then there's a whole separate section about Jewish kings and non-Jewish kings that we're going to ignore also. But I don't think it matters here, but you can argue with me later. And that again seems to prove, right? So that seems to prove that you can, for the honor of kings, right? You're going to greet kings. For the honor of kings, you Kohanim can violate their prohibition against becoming tamei. And the Gemara gives the same kind of answer. The Gemara says that it's following Rava, and Rava took the position that coffins, jumping over coffins for a Kohen is only a prohibition to Rabbanan and not a prohibition to Oraita. Because why would a Kohen become tamei by jumping over a coffin? It becomes tamei because the Kohen's body is as if it's a tent, and therefore the tumor rises to the top of the tent. But if the coffin itself is a prior tent, so putting a tent over a tent is not a problem. And Rava said that the halacha is that it's considered a tent if there's even a step up distance between the top of the corpse and the lid of the coffin, and that generally there is in fact such a gap, and therefore d'oraita you could rely on robe and jump over the coffin. But the rabbi said no, don't rely on that. Right, you're not allowed to do it because there's always a chance that in this particular case the body occupies too much space in the. Yeah, that's correct. Right. You're probably, we are framing it as a conflict between a halacha and a value, as opposed to the value. Yeah, not becoming tamei. Well, the value of greeting the king. Okay, so very good, right? So this is part of the same paradox I pointed out initially, right? That we framed it as if it's a conflict between divine command and some independent value, but what we're going to discover is that the halakha itself recognizes these values, and so really we're just having a conversation within halakha, right? What does God want? Which takes precedent. That's right. Yeah. Although halachot about kavod seem to be framed here as as a generic act in accordance with this value, as opposed to, if there were a breita that said you must go greet kings, right? That would be much less interesting, right? Because so the answer is no. There's this breita that said we used to greet kings, and the Gemara says, why did you used to greet kings? We used to greet kings because we thought it was the right thing to do. king. And why would you be allowed to do that? Well, because of kavod. But once we say it's the Rabbanan, once we say it's only rabbinic, so then we can say, no, actually, you know what? That's just a rabbinic decision. And now we can write, so it's not actually a conflict between halacha and a value, right? Really, when the rabbis set up the laws, the rabbis took these things into account. And since the rabbis created the prohibition, so they could build the exceptions, right? So part of at this stage, if we understand the second, right, this language has really b'shum kvod malachim lo gazru b'hu rabbanan. Because of the honor of kings, the rabbis never made such a decree. So that sounds very much like we're making a claim that this is not a conflict between halacha and values. This is a case where the law itself has already incorporated the value. But if you could find a case where that was not true, even rabbinic law might trump, right? Might trump human dignity. And in fact, there are rabbinic laws that, right? There are times when the rabbis punish you, and they punish you, they take away your dignity. There are times when the rabbis punish you by depriving you of dignity, right? The Gemara says that if people got their korban pesach tamei, they would take it, they would burn it in public in order to embarrass you. So it's possible to say, right, that the narrowest reading so far is that, right, if we set up our abstract equation, formal halacha, in which we understand to be divine command, always beats values. But we should be aware that sometimes in rabbinic law they incorporated values into it, but when they didn't, formal halacha always beats values. That would be the narrowest reading of what we had so far. Yes, Ian.
So
yeah.
That's
Right.
That seems
So maybe we'll say they created a default, right? Whenever the rabbis make a decree, the default is that when it conflicts with royal honor, they don't intend their decree to apply. Right now, they also seem to say, then we have to claim to do the same thing. They said the same thing about mourner's honor, right? Because that's the first case, right? So we could do it that way, right? We could say that, right? We still have a principle that whatever is the formal law is interpreted as a divine command. Values are wishy-washy things. Values always lose to formal law. And we believe that's because formal law represents God's will, which is not obvious. We could just say values lose to formal law. But we don't say that. We say values lose to formal law because formal law expresses God's command. And it just happens that the rabbis chose sometimes to incorporate those values into formal law because it's only rabbinic law anyway. So there's nothing there except values anyway. But we could say that. Okay, I pointed out last time just for fun that in this case also you might think it's how can they claim that it's only talking about the Rabbanan? So I argued that it happens. Right? In order to make this case real, you have to claim that there is a Beit Midrash. The Beit Midrash is only one exit. That exit is through a mausoleum. The mausoleum has no aisles in it, so the only way to get out is by jumping over coffins. There's a public road right outside the only exit, which is through the mausoleum, and there are kings passing by regularly, and therefore, we used to regularly, right? We used to jump over coffins in order to be king. At some point, somebody should have opened an exit the other way, or made an aisle, or something, right, or something like that. So I suggested that the Gemara Sanhedrin, which talks about cases in halacha that never happened, never will. So the two famous cases, as opposed to tzarat of houses, which doesn't get talked about as much. The two famous cases are the Ben Serera Mored, the rebellious son, and the Irnei Dachat, the idolatrous city. And in each of those cases, there's a Braita with a Talmudic position which says it never happened, it never will happen. And then a character named Rabbi Yonatan in Amora says, Ani Reitiv, I saw him. In the case of the Ben Serera Mored, V'yashafti al kivro, and I sat on his grave. In the case of the Irnei Dachat, Ani Reitiv V'yashafti al tilo, I sat on the tel where the city used to be. And the problem always is that Rabbi Yonatan, assuming he's the usual Rabbi Yonatan, is a Kohen. So Kohanim should not be sitting on. Right. The second problem is chronological. There is no, in the time of the Amoraim, there is no capital punishment, right? No capital jurisdiction. There's certainly no Irnei Dachat, right? So on what basis could he On what basis can he say he said this? So my suggestion is that this is just the way that Kohanim like to talk. And Kohanim want to say, right? Kohanim like to talk about their kuna. This is still true in some cases, and so when they wanted to make it, to say something very emphatic, they would say, I'm as sure of this as if I had become tummy. And so that understands. That's why Rabbi Yonatan says I sat on the grave, and that's why Rabbi Eliezer said I used to jump over coffins. Right, it's just a way of Kohanim making it. And so then when they're constructing that case, so the only case he constructs is the case which is with coffins, which are only Rabbanan. So he probably means it on purpose. It means he couldn't. Right, it's really saying as sure as this, as if I had become Tamid Rabbanan, but not right, but not Tamid D'Oraita. Okay, that's where we were last time. So now we get up to number 3. All right, Tashma. So this seems like the big whopper, and again, so you can see that it's a constructed sugya that we didn't present this first, because we presented this practice first, and the last two would have been very anticlimactic. Tashma, gadol kol habriot shedoche et lotas. Whether you have the head or not is a question. Lotas seishem Torah. Kol habriot is great, and what is its greatness? What is right? Its greatness is that it pushes aside a negative commandment in the Torah. Now, again, the author of this sugya knew this before we started, that there was a bright out there which said, Kol habriot is so great, human dignity is so great that it pushes aside a negative commandment in the Torah, and nonetheless started with a proposition, right? Let's say Ein Chachma v'Ein Tefuna v'Ein Sal v'Neged Hashem. Okay, so we set it up this way. So right, how could there be a bright that says this? Doesn't contradict our basic principle. So Tirgam Rav Shva Kamei Rav Kahana, and again, this is not in response to this question. This is a prior dialogue that's being incorporated into the sugya. Tirgam Rav Shva Kamei Rav Kahana Bilav Lo Tasur. Right, when it's right, it's only talking about the lo taseh of lo tasur. So the first thing we have to ask is, right, is this a stretch or not? So the text that we have, we'll see later the Yerushalmi's text, but the text that we have this bright in the Bavli, it doesn't say shedoche kol lo taseh shebetorah. So you can either interpret it as it pushes aside any lo taseh in the Torah, or you can say interpret it a lo taseh in the Torah. So Ghana says that this is a statement that is deliberately provocative, but then intended to be drawn back. Right, that it pushes aside one lo taseh in the Torah. Now I have to figure out which lo taseh in the Torah. So the answer is the lo taseh of lo tasur. So lo tasur is right. Don't stray from what they say left or right. So now we have a dialogue, which I think there are two ways of reading, although not clear the second one that anyone else thinks exists. The one says achichu alei. They laughed at Rav Bar Shva for saying this. They laughed at him by saying, the law of the lo tasur is deoraita, and Rav Kahana responds by saying, "This is a great man said this. Don't laugh at him. All rabbinic matters were attached to the law of the lo tasur. You have to try to figure out like what's the havamina and what's the maskana here, and why did they laugh at him? Right? And when they laughed at him, why did they say lo tasur deoraita? Right? What's funny about it? It's not a claim that's weird. You're making up an okimta, because then right makes no sense. They just say they laughed at him. It says every lo taseh. So here they laugh at him because they don't believe either they believe that lo tasur is not really deoraita, and therefore it can't really be described as a lo taseh shebetorah in this context at least, or they think that lo tasur is just like every other deoraita. And since it's just like every other deoraita, the okimta is pointless, because why would this be different than any other? Okay, that's the way most people read it. Right? Lo tasur deoraita, they left it and said, well, you haven't solved anything. In that case, the response is, Rav Kahana's response is, kol mili derabanan asmechinhu alav de lo tasur. So the word asmachta is a problematic term. Asmachta refers to some kind of quasi-relationship between a rabbinic law and a biblical text. Right? When you have what seems to be a biblical derivation of rabbinic law, and then we say, nah, not really. It's not really what the verse means. We just sort of stuck it on. So you might say, okay, so it's just a mnemonic. Right? I generally am, most comfortable saying it's just a mnemonic, but you have to be aware that there are positions among Rishonim that say no, that a law that is attached to a verse has more authority than a regular rabbinic law. You could always then say, that's because the rabbi, when the rabbis attached it to a verse, they were deliberately giving it more status if they didn't attach it to a verse. But usually it's not the original rabbis making the decree who attach it to a verse. It's somebody coming along later. So I leave the Termas Machta as a mess. But here, right, so that's our structure of our sugya, right? The Gemara, there's a braita that says lo tasur. There's a challenge. Either lo tasur is too weak or too, right, or is just like every other deraisa. The solution is that lo tasur also refers to laws that are really rabbinic, right? Maybe it means that it refers to rabbinic laws that have some more connection to deoraitas than others. Really hard, right? There's the Gemara talks about things that have an ikar min Torah. The Rabbanas have an ikar min Torah. The Rabbanas that don't have an ikar min Torah. I learned from Rabbi Saul Berman years ago when I was like they taught me about predictive principles. When somebody gives you a principle, I said, explain this data. So then you ask, okay, right, if I have another case, does this rule give me any evidence at all about what to do in the following case? And if it doesn't, then it's not really an explanation. Right, so he used that, he taught that to me in the context of whether women are really exempt from time-bound commandments. If you start with, if you just started with the principle women are exempt from commandments, would you actually get the whole color we have it? The answer is no. Women are actually obligated in more time-bound commandments than they're exempt. So it's right. So it's more likely a mnemonic for a set of mitzvot from which women are exempt than the explanation. For the reason it could be the explanation, just there are lots of reasons not, or it could be it's just a mnemonic. I use in the I think the Gemara sometimes challenges somebody, and the point of the series of challenges which yield a teku, like we don't know the answer. So sometimes teku is an attack because the result of, what they've done is they've proven that you can't answer any questions based on your rule. If you can't answer any questions based on your rule, what use is your right? What use is your rule, right? That okay. So I have not found any convincing account of the differences among Rabbanans based on their relationship to deraisos, although I have tried a couple of times. And it might be that within specific thinkers you can find something that resembles more of an actual case. But be that as it may, the effect of the last line again is a mishum kivudo sharu Rabbanan. It's because of his honor. Now, whose honor is it? Yeah, I think it has to be human honor, right? Hypothetically, human honor, and not God's honor. I think that would be cheating. So I think the simple way of reading it is that we have now taken the two previous rules, and we take the two previous cases, and in the two previous cases we resolve them in each case by saying there's an okimta. It says only talking about the Rabbanan, and now we have justified our okimta by saying actually there's a general rule. And the general rule really is the rabbis built in an exemption for kvod habriot every time that it conflicts with their law. So now instead of now we really have two propositions. One proposition is biblical law, deoraita law, beats kvod habriot, and the counter proposition is that kvod habriot beats rabbinic law. And well, the easy way out of this is to say, and that doesn't conflict with the problem of there's nothing that stands against God, because that's all internal rabbinic decision. And so we've solved that problem. And we've also, along the way, we have implicitly made the claim that all forms of human dignity are alike, because we said it. We started with honor of mourners, then we went to honor of kings, and now we're going to generalize human dignity. Right. So what really just set up is that rabbinic law sort of works with an a priori principle that that we're not going to infringe on human dignity, however defined, right? And it's an interesting thing, why is that? That's an animating feature of rabbinic law. It's an assumption of all rabbinic law, even though we are now claiming that it has absolutely no value in divine law. Right? Where do the rabbis get this value from? Well, again, we can solve it by saying that we're just talking technically that whenever God chooses to command, then in human conceptions of human dignity have no role. Right? We can still solve it that way. Right. Maybe God cares deeply about human dignity, but we presume that when God cares deeply about human dignity, that He builds it into the law. And if God didn't build it into the law, so then we still say that nothing humanly conceived of outside the framework of formal halacha has any value in formal halacha. And that's how we can set it up at this point. Yes?
your giving dignity. That distinction matters.
So I'm arguing, right, that the nature of this sugya is to treat everything as pure abstractions. And so, for example, there are no differences in degree within the sugya. Right, nobody, right, it doesn't say, well, great dishonor to kings overrides rabbinic halacha, but minor dishonor to kings doesn't. Right, the nature of the sugya is to create is abstraction, and that's a generally interesting question. Do the rabbis think abstractly or not? This seems to be an interesting case where they're only thinking abstractly. Like there are 1,000 ways you can distinguish each case. You can frame each case, but they're setting it up. They began by assigning an abstraction as the meaning of the opening statement, and they respond by treating every counter case as an abstraction. Now, what that will mean for the way we do law afterwards is an interesting question. But in the context of the sugya, I don't think that what kind of human dignity it is matters. I don't think how intense human dignity is matters. Right? None of that matters right now at all, and none of it will matter, I don't believe, throughout. I think that's a really interesting question as to what extent, because they're thinking the cases are concrete, and there's always a debate, when you have casuistic thinkers, right, who are arguing through cases, are they thinking conceptually or not? So here I think it's a sugya where it's very clear that they set it out as an abstraction, and they never allow any of the details to affect the abstraction. Okay, so that could be someone's doctrine for all I know. I don't know. I think the sugya that we enjoy tend to be neatly abstract, like the famous sugya, because they're the easiest. They're the sugya which are regular and patterned and all, right? So whether they're typical, and that's really how the thing people think throughout, is an interesting question. But I think that a lot of and you can also claim, of course, that I'm just imposing order on the sugya. But I think in this case, like it's the structure of the sugya is to make is an abstraction, and then we keep repeating that abstraction in all the other cases, and we never say that case is different because of a concrete reason. We only say that case is different because of an abstract reason. Right, so I think the sugya functions purely abstractly.
So when we read parts where they were supposed to honor our parents.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
But it's also the word he used here.
Interesting. So I talked to the first biggest, but it's a great way of framing it, that that you have a question in terms of whether kibbud av v'em is an intensification of human dignity, or is an entirely independent thing. It might be, as a literary point, might be interesting that the one kind of kavod that never shows up in the sugya is kibbud av v'em. Right, because that would be too easy. Right, to make that would blow up the fiction at the beginning that we're actually talking about whether we can go against God's will, because God's will is so strong there. Now you could then say, that proves that kibbud av v'em is not actually just a subset of human dignity, but is an entirely separate feature. Right, and I could build whole universes based on the claim that kibbud av v'em is not about human dignity at all. Kibbud av v'em is about three partners in creation, and whatever you want. I don't think it'd be true though. My tendency is probably that mentioning kibbud av v'em would blow up the sugya because it would expose the fiction of the opening question, which is a great point. It's a great point. Maybe we'll do it. Let's just see. It's not in the book. We can talk about another sugya which plays with different concepts of kavod and everything to set this up. Okay, excellent. Okay, so now we have gotten through the first three, and the end of the first three, we're really, we've just simplified it to just there are only three values: the right to law, rabbinic law, and kod habriot. Kod habriot comes right in the middle. But philosophically, we have maintained our initial claim that if it's formal halacha, it's formal halacha that is framed as the oraita, then values no longer play a role at all. Okay, so now we get to the next, the Tashma. So you have a verse which says, V'hit alamta mehem. So V'hit alamta mehem is an odd verse. It plays off an ambiguity. It says, do not, right? the verse says, "Do not see your friends, or your neighbor, whatever you want to call it, your fellows, animals straying, and hide yourself from it." So this is one of the things that that you like teaching kids about syntactical ambiguity. Does it mean do not see right? Do not see your friend's animal and hide yourself from it, or does that mean do not see your friend's animal and hide yourself from it? Okay, right. This is the version of the the alligator eating the ant, whatever, whatever it may be. Okay, so the rabbis take advantage of this syntactic ambiguity, and they say, There are right. The ambiguity is they're both true, and they're just right, and they're just telling you you have to choose among the cases. So I think you could probably argue also that it really means is they understand that the primary meaning is you're not supposed to hide yourself from it. So the default setting, right? The default setting is you're not allowed, right? You're not allowed to look away when your neighbor's thing is missing. But the ambiguity is a fun way which God built in the notion that there are exceptions. Okay, we saw a similar thing those who were here in Shabbos Mincha, right? That one of the two drushos, the initial drusha about whether a Kohen is allowed to delay looking at a nega in order to avoid messing up somebody's week of natural happiness. So you says biyom herod bo. Well, there are days in which you there are days in which you look at it, and days in which you don't look at it. Right, so this is a genre of midrash. Okay, so I look at what are the cases you look at it, what are the cases you don't look at it. So Hakesad, right? So Hakesad is asking for illustrations of the prior abstraction. So im haya kohen v'hi b'veit hakvarot. So if you're a kohen and the missing animal is in a cemetery, so then you don't have to go get the animal. So that probably doesn't take us this verse. That's just basic law. Basic law is you don't violate lotases in order to fulfill essays. Now there's a variant rule about that, which is we actually say asay docha lotase, that when there's a conflict between a positive and a negative commandment, then you do follow the positive commandment. But then that is a principle midrash halacha, not a principle of action, really. So and there are all sorts of straits about that. We can spend lots of time just talking about why is there a principle of say docha lotase when in practice you're never supposed to do a lotase, the violent essay. So treat that as a special case, and the default case is the default setting is that you don't violate a negative commandment to fulfill yes. And so probably while this is true, right? If you're coming with a list of cases where you don't get the lost object, it's true that this is on it, but it's not true that the ambiguity was built in to teach us this, because we knew it already. Okay, the last case is shaitam l'achtom ruba mishal chaviro, which is if you take in your neighbor's lost animal, you're entitled to recoup your expenses. Right, for taking care of it. We don't require you. So what happens if it inevitably the expenses will be more than the animal itself is worth? And what happens if the expenses of recovering the animal will be more than it's worth? So the answer is that we can do that in terms of billing your time, right? We can make all sorts of lawyer jokes or whatever we want to do it. But the answer is the purpose of the mitzvah is that you're not is to save your friend's money, not to make money for yourself, and therefore in such cases there's no mitzvah. Okay, that probably also doesn't take this verse. That's probably built into the nature of the mitzvah. So it's the middle case, which is most likely the case that actually is being derived from the syntactic ambiguity. The middle case is ohaya zaken ve'na lefi chvodo. If the person chasing the lost object is a zaken, the zaken could mean elderly, but more likely means a leader in the community. And there's some right, and it's ena lefi chvodo. So ena lefi chvodo, I like to think about it just like that retrieving it is will require actions that are beneath your dignity. You have an elder all dressed up and you have to chase somebody's animal through a mudslide. But usually the Rishonim give it differently. That it's the kind of thing that if it were your own, you wouldn't bother picking it up. Right? It would be underrated. People would think of you, as that's not like you're a rich guy. You shouldn't be bending over to pick up pennies in the street. So the question is, right, what about picking up somebody else's penny? Right. So the answer is right, but be that as it may, since we're not interested in the right, we're treating it as an abstraction. The abstraction here is a person, and that person has some kind of dignity. It seems like we're not going to distinguish, although that's very conceptually, it's very important to distinguish between intrinsic dignity and social dignity. Right, so once again, we're fudging, right? We just went from Kvod HaBriot, right? And now we're going to talk about Kvod HaZaken. And Kvod HaZaken is probably a form of dignity that depends on position. So even though it's a form of dignity that depends on position and it's not intrinsic. And by the way, in terms of our initial claim, right, we could have said that intrinsic human dignity is right, Kvod HaBriot, we could have said is not a question of going to human values against God, because intrinsic human dignity is what comes from being a Tzelem Elokim, and really honoring God. Whereas social dignity is purely a human construct. So we could have made a sharp distinction between intrinsic and social dignity, but we don't. Again, we just treat social dignity as exactly the same as all forms of dignity in the context of this sugya. So we say is right. The Gemara says, so if you're a zaken and it is beneath your social dignity to fulfill the mitzvah of returning lost animals, you don't have to. Separate question whether you should or you shouldn't. You don't have to. The Gemara asks, okay, why don't you have to? Like, right, there's a halacha, you have to return lost object. So here the fiction gets exposed again, right? Because it's a medrash halacha. Right, we're claiming that the Torah put this syntactic ambiguity in to teach us that you don't have to return it. And yet the Gemara says, let's say there's no wisdom against God, right? No, we're trying to figure out what God means. So right, so here the proposition that there's no wisdom against God would have to mean that when the Oraita law is given to human discretion, right, human beings should not consider human dignity as a fact. That's a much dicier proposition. Why not? If God considered, right, if it's part of God's original system, right, what should we take into account? Right? If the Torah says sometimes you do it and sometimes you don't, and it has to be a case which, right, the whole point of it is it has to teach me something that isn't obvious for the rest of halacha. Because if it were obvious, I wouldn't need this ambiguity. So what am I supposed to do, right? Is it better if I do it arbitrarily? And I take a rule, every 10th person doesn't have to pick up lost objects. You don't have to pick up lost objects that are green. Right, so here we expose the fiction much more sharply, right? When you have the attempt to claim that Ein Chachma Ve'Ein Ktuna Ve'Netzal Neged Hashem means that human beings are not even allowed to consider values when interpreting God's will. And that can't be. There is no other way to deal with discretionary cases except on the basis of values. And to claim that dafka we should exclude the value of human, right, the values of dignity when the halacha builds them in all over the place is a very odd thing. But okay, we're going to take it. We take it straightforwardly. So the Gemara answers, which is a wonderful answer. Shani hatam. That right. Right, that case is different because okay, so here we have the terms I always use for this are binyan av and chidush. Not everyone uses those terms, but I'm going to use them that way. Right? So whenever you have a law, a legal detail, right? Something that like something that could be a general principle attached to a specific case. Right? And the Torah only tells us with regard to one law. So the question is, do we take that law and say, aha, the Torah said it's here, that must be a paradigm, the same thing, right? We should apply the same abstraction to every other law. Or do we say, the Torah said it here, obviously, the Torah said it here because it's not true everywhere else. It had to say it here. Right? So when we say when it becomes a paradigm case, that's called a binyan av. When we say it's an exception, it's called a chidush. The difference between them, here people get in trouble with me, but I think it's right. There is purely based on your prior intuition. If you thought, right, if this is what you expected anyway, so then it's a binyan av. And if it's not what you expected, then it's a chidush. I don't think there's any other. That's what my prime ways of teaching students, that you can't. There's no such thing as learning halacha without preconceptions, because halacha is built off preconceptions. It's like just like suspense, right? Suspense only works, right, because of certain expectations. Okay. So the Gemara's havamina here is different. So then the law is constructed by a process where all the people who get votes, that may be, put their intuitions together. But so we might argue that in order to be part of what makes you qualified to be a legislator is that your intuitions have been tested and are treated as legitimate by the other people in the system. But yeah, that's fair. But in principle, right? I can't tell you that the text interprets itself. Okay. So the Gemara's first approach is, so right now we have to get the whole structure of the sugi again together, right? So we start off by saying shatnez. Right? You have to take your clothes. You have to take your clothes off. I should point out, just cheating, by the way, there is rabbinic shatnez. We could have just solved the whole problem. Right? Yeah, but okay, right. But okay. So we're assuming that we have this paradigm case of or we made a worse problem by saying it's rabbinic shatnez. I guess I said even you have to take your clothes even for rabbinic shatnez. That would have solved the whole problem. We're assuming right now that we officially say you have to take shatnez, you have to take your shatnez clothing off of the marketplace. That means halakha always. Then we basically said, oh, that only was biblical shatnez, not rabbinic shatnez, but we still have biblical shatnez as our primary case. And now we have a counter case, which is, hang on a sec, why do you have to take your clothes off in public if you don't even have to pick up somebody else's lost object? And the answer is, you know what? This rule about not picking up lost objects is a chiddush. The fact the Torah has to tell me that I'm allowed to ignore someone else's lost objects teaches me that generally human dignity has no role. Okay, that's a shani hatam. That case is different. In that case, is unique because in that case there was a verse that gives us the authority to let human dignity in, but you couldn't do it anywhere else. Yeah.
Question on Owen.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So that's why I argue that those cases are not really derived from the verse. Those cases are known previously. And the only case that's derived from the verse is the case of the Kohen. Because we already knew that a Kohen couldn't, right? Kohen, not that a Kohen doesn't have to, a Kohen isn't allowed to. You're not allowed to take the lost object, it's going to cost somebody else money, right? The chiddush is that you don't have to do this, right? That's exactly right. Okay. So the Gemara says, Shani hatem d'chsiv le'vantam mehem, and then the Gemara says, why do you think this is a chiddush? Let's make it a paradigm instead. Why is it counterintuitive? Right, and that's a big question because that implicates the whole opening framework. But all of a sudden, it's not so intuitive. Right? We think this is a paradigm, and the Gemara now the Gemara says, you know what? When we do the paradigm, we can't do the paradigm. It doesn't expand infinitely. It expands until the first reasonable point where we can cut off its expansion. So we're going to say, you know what? This is a paradigm, but the paradigm only extends so far, the Gemara says, as mamona. We don't move from money to ritual. And therefore, just because I'm allowed to look away at someone's lost object, and thereby not fulfill a mitzvah that is related to money, doesn't mean that human dignity has any standing against a ritual mitzvah. Yeah. Why? It's a fine formal distinction, but what's left of our opening thesis that now human dignity has value against God, but only has value against God when God is talking about money. Why? And so we have a technical establish a waiting. Yeah, we can set it formally right now, right? With my high school students, kind of equations, right? So it's halakha d'oraita isura is greater than kvod habriyot, which is greater than halakha d'oraita of amon, right? And maybe which is either equal or greater to than halakha d'rabanan. Mm-hmm. Right now, do we then go back and say maybe halakha d'rabanan is also only true? Right? Does this override the previous distinctions? And it turns out that all no, because we override halakha d'rabanan about isura in those cases also. Yeah, it's only the right. Yeah. I just think but there's nothing, there's no principle left anymore. Because we just decided it's intuitive to expand it. Right? We're making it being out, right? But then we say, okay, but formally, even when it's intuitive, we can only expand it to other things like this law. So that's not there's no principle anymore that stops it. Now we're just playing, now we're just playing Talmud and figuring out what the parameters are. Okay, all right, so we have one more. The Gemara says Tashma. Now this is a really, really complicated brayta, and we're going to just do it one way probably, and then we'll see if the many ways of understanding it actually affect the thesis that we have. The Gemara says V'lachoto. So the right, so somebody, either a Kohen Gadol or Nazir, we have to figure it out, is not allowed to become tamei even for a sister. A sister dies for the funeral or for the burial. Okay, so Harei Shayeh, so we have to figure out like how we get from that word lachoto. So there's a whole list of relatives, and each of the relatives has to get us another case. So we're going to write. So it's very hard to figure out exactly what she's talking about. Right. So Harei Shayeh, right? If it turns out the matter, we're going to have to go back and go through Rashi and Tosfot and all the people who tried to get this midrash halacha to make sense. It ends up being, according to Rashi, it's based on a midah of midrash halacha called the im enu inyan. The im enu inyan is a great one. It says, well, if this doesn't make any sense in context, let's apply it somewhere else. And so you can try, right? I was very proud of the shir I had making sense of this one, but it's still, it's a very hard thing to get to be coherent. So, so what is the purpose of including the specific case of the sister in the context of this pasuk? So we have it. So we answer it without giving it, right? We just answer it by giving cases without giving a rule. So Harei Halech lishchut et pischo. So he's going to shecht his korban pesach, v'lamul et beno, or to circumcise his son. The shema shemet lo meit. On his way to doing these mitzvot, which are the only mitzvot aseh that you get kares for not doing by a specific time. Right, the korban pesach has to be brought by Pesach, and the brit milah has to be done on the 8th day. So you're on your way to do these mitzvot, which you will get kares for not doing, and you hear that one of your relatives has died. Now, how this relates to brit milah, why you can't do both of brit milah is an interesting question. Let's focus on the korban pesach for now. You can't bring a korban pesach when you're tamei. So if you go bury your relative, you're not going to be able to bring your korban pesach. So should the positive mitzvah of burying your relative take precedence in the sense that you do it even though you know it will create a situation in which you can't fulfill your mitzvah to bring your korban pesach. Okay, so also ignoring the maybe Pesach is different because and he's always circumcised the day after, right? You don't get kares anymore if you're circumcised on the 9th day, right? It's true. You're liable for kares if you. Yeah, it's the end of which verse. It shows that right. I'm fudging everything right now. Exactly right, because we're hitting our end. We'll if it turns out we'll do it in detail next time. Or that's the second thing that I Marty and you, right? All of you, okay, right? That the limits. I'm trying to do it simply first, and then we'll complicate it. Okay, so we have this case. So Amarth lo yitama. So it teaches you that no, right? You're allowed to. You go on doing your mitzvah say sheyesh bo karet. You go on. And you leave your relative. You do not have to engage in burying your relative if that will mean you can't bring your korban pesach. So I might think that the same rule applies to a meit mitzvah. A meit mitzvah is someone who dies and has no relatives to bury them. So previously we were talking about your involvement in the burial of somebody who will anyway get buried. Now we're talking about the question of whether in the same circumstance, but the consequence will not be that you won't be involved in the burial. The consequence will be the person won't be buried. So there is Talmud Lomer v'lachoto. So the word lachoto teaches you that it's only for relatives. But for non-relatives whom you have an obligation to bury, which is what we call mitzvah, then you have to stop. You have to stop and become tamei, even though that will prevent you from bringing your korban pesach. You have to stop and bury them, let's say, even if that means that the circumcision will be delayed till the 9th day. Okay. So the Gemara says, Amai, Lema in Chachma ve'etzal neged Hashem. So for our purposes, what we're going to interpret this to mean is, in some way, the burial is is a fulfillment of the It's the ultimate fulfillment. Leaving human body unburied is an ultimate violation of the buried. It's another form of kavod. And therefore, what we're saying here is that the burial of a beit mitzvah, which is the fulfillment of kavod, enables you to not fulfill your other law. Yeah. Yeah. And it's derived from where the kind of thing is derived from Allah. You're not allowed to leave it. It doesn't seem yeah. So what it means is that we break the sugya down in this way. That the fiction of the sugya breaks down, and we're not interested in the theological question. We're interested in, right? Granted that we have lots of discretion in terms of our interpretation of halacha, how much value should we give to Hebraiot in creating halacha? Right. That's really right. That's really what the stakes of the sugya have been all the way through. And we quote this last, even though if you were to ask me what is the source for all human dignity playing a role in halacha, the answer is this: Beit mitzvah is the paradigm, right? For all, right? That's like, where do we get the idea that the Torah cares about dignity? The answer is the Torah says you have to bury the dead. Why does it bury the dead? Because the dead body is somehow considered to be a representation of God. As an extreme version, you have the parable of the twins, right? One of whom becomes king, one of them becomes a robber, and the robber is captured and crucified, and the king says, "Take him down," because people say the king is hanging there. Right? And the metaphor is that that having human being displayed grotesquely is a denigration of God, because human beings are the cell of a whole separate debate about whether that implies any some kind of image of God in a literal sense or not. Nachum Roberbaum built his book off the claim. I think that it does. I don't think so, but yeah, I think you're entirely right that this line just blows up the sugya. It makes it clear that we never thought that the issue was whether we allow values that are independently derived to contradict values we derive from God. The real question is, in the hierarchy of values we get from God, what role is human dignity playing? Okay. Then the Gemara is going to answer by saying, well, you know what? No, Shani Hata Lachoto, right? It's the same answer. Oh, maybe we'll make that case exception. Right. So that you can't learn anything from that case. And that way we'll be left with our complete incoherence of that nothing has any power against God except when God is talking about money. And so here too we're going to say really government, why don't we derive from this that human dignity always triumphs over halacha? And the answer is no. It's different here because here we're not telling you to violate the halacha. We're telling you to not do something that halacha tells you to do. Even though it's a case where halacha punishes you for not doing it, you get karet for not bringing your korban pesach. You get karet for not circumcising your son. But we're not telling you to actively violate halacha. We're telling you to passively allow an obligation to pass. So the end of the sugya apparently is that our equation is halacha d'oraita, which is active, and assuming that these are additive, right? The people who think they're not additive, they're alternatives, but let's assume they're additive, right? So halacha d'oraita, which relates to ritual and requires is triumphs put up if you would have to actively violate it, but not if you only have to passively violate it. And that has nothing to do with the equation. So we're left with nothing coherent at all. And the question is, what are we supposed to do with this sugya? Right, if it leaves us with nothing coherent at all. Okay, so we'll take that up next time, and then we'll try and get to the Rishon, how that one Rishon plays out. Thank you very much for coming.